When a narcissistic woman is alone, the silence does not bring peace. It activates memory. Begins to replay moments where she felt powerful, admired, or emotionally dominant. Not because those moments were meaningful, but because they temporarily stabilize her sense of self. Carl Jung observed that when the ego is fragile, it must constantly reinforce its image, and in solitude, memory becomes the stage where this reinforcement takes place. These mental replays are not reflections, they are rehearsals of identity. She revisits conversations where she had the upper hand, moments where someone reacted, pleaded, or bent. In those memories, she still exists as the central figure. The past becomes a substitute for the present because the present offers no audience. This is important to understand. The narcissistic mind does not rest in silence. It works to preserve an image that cannot survive without validation. But there is a quiet cost to this repetition. Each replay fixes her deeper into what Jung would call a persona, an outer mask mistaken for the self. The more she relies on these power memories, the less capable she becomes of genuine self-reflection. Growth requires confronting the shadow, but nostalgia for dominance prevents that confrontation. So she loops, again and again. What makes this significant for you is this: while she is stuck, reliving moments of control, you are no longer there. You are not reacting. You are not reinforcing the memory. And slowly, without confrontation, something destabilizes. The memories lose their charge. Power without presence fades. This is where the shift begins. Because real strength does not come from being remembered, it comes from being free. When you stop living inside her mental replay, you exit the psychological contract entirely, and that is the moment the past stops controlling your future. Remember this: the person who must relive power has already lost it. When she is alone, something subtle but revealing takes place. Without eyes on her, without reactions to shape her sense of worth, the narcissistic woman begins to manufacture validation in her mind. She imagines conversations where she is admired, scenarios where she is missed, moments where her absence causes longing. This is not fantasy in the creative sense. It is psychological compensation. Jung understood this as the psyche's attempt to balance an inner deficiency. Where real affirmation is absent, the mind fabricates it. The critical point is this: her identity depends on being reflected back to herself. Alone, there is no mirror, so she creates one. These imagined affirmations are not indulgent daydreams. They are survival mechanisms for an ego that cannot tolerate insignificance. The more unstable the inner self, the louder the inner applause must become. But imagined validation has a limit. It carries no resistance, no unpredictability, no genuine encounter with another soul. And without those elements, the psyche does not mature, it stagnates. Jung warned that when imagination replaces relationship, the individual becomes cut off from reality, imprisoned by an image rather than grounded in being. Over time, this internal theater grows hollow. The admiration feels thinner. The reassurance fades faster. She must replay it more often just to feel normal. What matters for you is not her inner world, but what your absence does to it. When you stop providing real emotional engagement, fantasy becomes her only refuge. And fantasy, no matter how vivid, cannot replace the weight of a living presence. This is why detachment is so powerful. It does not punish. It simply removes the mirror. And here is the deeper truth: the self that requires constant validation, real or imagined, is not a self at all, but a performance. When you withdraw your attention, you are not abandoning her. You are reclaiming your own psychic energy. So reflect on this carefully. Do not compete with illusion. Step out of it. Because the moment you stop feeding a false image, reality quietly reasserts itself. And that is where real freedom begins. When she is alone, the narcissistic woman often turns her attention outward again, but quietly, indirectly, and without contact. She watches, she monitors, she checks traces of your life, not out of care in the human sense, but out of psychological necessity. Jung spoke of projection as a way the psyche manages inattention. When she cannot regulate her sense of self internally, she seeks external reference points. You become one of them. Your progress, your silence, your emotional distance, these are not neutral facts to her. They are symbols. Each one answers a question she cannot stop asking: do I still matter? When she observes you moving forward, stable or unaffected, it disrupts the story she tells herself about power and significance. Control, for her, is not always direct. Sometimes it is simply knowing she still occupies space in your inner world. What's important to understand is that this monitoring is not strength. It is dependence disguised as curiosity. A grounded self does not need to check whether it still exists in another's mind, but a fragile ego does. Jung would describe this as the ego's fear of dissolution, the terror of becoming psychologically irrelevant. Silence from you does not bring closure for her, it removes orientation. And here is where the dynamic subtly reverses. The more she watches, the more she confirms something she does not want to face. Your life is no longer organized around her. This realization does not arrive dramatically. It arrives slowly, through repeated exposure to your absence of reaction. No emotional spikes, no public signals, just quiet continuity. This is deeply unsettling to a narcissistic structure, because without your emotional response, positive or negative, there is nothing to extract, nothing to shape, nothing to control. The gaze remains, but the influence weakens. Observation without impact becomes frustration. For you, this is not about being seen or unseen. It is about reclaiming autonomy. When you live without broadcasting, without defending, without proving, you step outside the psychological field she depends on. So take this with you. Attention is power only when it alters behavior. When you stop living for the watcher loses meaning. And in that moment you are no longer being observed. You are finally free. When solitude removes distraction, another process begins, one that is far less visible but deeply revealing. She starts to explain herself to herself. The narcissistic woman does not sit with her actions. In order to understand them, she TS with them in order to neutralize them. Jung noted that the ego will do almost anything to avoid guilt, because guilt threatens the image it has worked so hard to construct. So instead of remorse, there is revision. She reorders the story. What was betrayal becomes self-preservation. What was manipulation becomes necessity. What was cruelty becomes provocation. This is not conscious lying in the ordinary sense, it is psychological self-defense. To admit wrongdoing would fracture the internal narrative of superiority and innocence, and so the past is rewritten, not to learn from it, but to survive it. This is where accountability disappears. True reflection requires the ego to step aside and allow the shadow to speak. But for her, the shadow is intolerable. Jung warned that when the shadow is rejected, it does not vanish, it rules from below. The justifications harden. They become beliefs. Over time, she no longer remembers events as they happened, only as they have been reframed.
What does this mean for you?
It means waiting for acknowledgement, apology, or understanding is futile. Not because she is incapable of words, but because truth would dismantle the structure she lives inside. Closure does not come from her recognition, it comes from your clarity. The moment you stop seeking validation of your experience from someone invested in denying it, the psychological grip loosens. And here is the deeper consequence for her. Every justification strengthens the prison. Each rewritten memory pushes genuine self-knowledge further away. She may feel calmer, even righteous, but growth has stopped. Without responsibility, there is no transformation, only repetition. For you, T. The lesson is precise and practical. Do not argue with a rewritten past. Do not defend reality to someone committed to avoiding it. Step out of the narrative entirely, because the truth does not need agreement to remain true, and the moment you stop asking to be understood by someone who cannot face themselves, You reclaim your power and move forward unburdened. When control is removed, something unexpected surfaces. Not rage, not sadness, but panic. In the absence of influence, the narcissistic woman encounters a silence she cannot manage. Jung understood control as a compensatory mechanism. When the inner world is unstable, the outer world must be tightly regulated. Control becomes a substitute for inner coherence. So when it disappears, the psyche feels exposed. Alone, she senses it first as restlessness, a need to check, to intervene, to provoke some response. Control, for her, is not about domination for its own sake. It is about orientation. Knowing where she stands in relation to you reassures her that she still exists as a force. When that reference point vanishes, anxiety rises, not because love is gone, but because leverage is. This is why emotional independence is so destabilizing. You are no longer predictable. You no longer orbit. Jung would say that when projection fails, when the other no longer carries the image we assign to them, the ego is forced to confront itself. That confrontation is terrifying for someone who has spent a lifetime avoiding it. What follows is an unspoken panic, not always dramatic, often quiet, a tightening inside, a sense that something essential has slipped away. She may tell herself she does not care, that she has moved on, but the nervous system tells a different story. Control lost is not easily replaced because it was never about you. It was about regulating her own inner chaos. For you, this moment is crucial. This is where many people break no contact, explain themselves, or re-enter emotionally, mistaking panic for vulnerability. But panic is not openness. It is resistance to change, and stepping back in only restores the old structure. Jung believed that transformation begins where control ends, but only if one can tolerate the uncertainty that follows. She cannot. You can. And that difference matters. Because when you remain steady without controlling, without reacting, without proving anything, you embody something she cannot access, inner authority. Not dominance, not withdrawal, but groundedness. So remember this, the anxiety you provoke by staying emotionally sovereign is not cruelty, it is truth. And if you do not rush to soothe what you did not break, you allow the old dynamic to collapse on its own. That is not abandonment, that is evolution. When she is finally alone, with no access, no reaction, no emotional leverage, a realization settles in that changes everything. It is not loud, it is not dramatic. It arrives quietly, and that is what makes it devastating. She begins to sense that she no longer occupies your inner world, not as anger, not as longing, not even as resistance. She is simply absent, and for a narcissistic structure, absence is annihilation. Jung spoke of psychological bonds as energetic investments. Where attention goes, energy flows. For a long time, your emotional responses, love, confusion, pain, explanation, kept that energy circulating. Even conflict maintained connection. But now, in the stillness, she feels something unfamiliar, disconnection without hostility. This is not rejection. It is indifference. And indifference cannot be negotiated with. This is the moment her internal strategies fail. Replaying memories no longer brings relief. Imagined validation feels thin. Monitoring your life produces no leverage. Justifications no longer stabilize the ego. Control is gone. What remains is the raw truth she has spent her life avoiding. She does not exist independently of attention, and without yours, the illusion collapses. Here is where the major impact on you becomes clear. The bond breaks not because she understands what she did, but because you understand who you became. You are no longer organizing your inner life around her behavior. Your nervous system has recalibrated. Your identity is no longer reactive, and that shift rewires power at its source. Jung believed that individuation begins when we withdraw projections and reclaim our psychic energy. This is exactly what happens here. You are no longer a character in her internal drama. You are the author of your own life again. And she senses it, not intellectually but instinctively. This is why no contact, emotional neutrality, and inner clarity are so effective. Not because they punish, but because they end the exchange. The psychological contract expires when one party stops participating. So leave this with you. Freedom is not proving your worth, explaining your pain, or being understood by someone who cannot see you. Freedom is the moment you are no longer required to be anything in another person's mind. When you step out of the story entirely, the story ends and your life finally begins.